Welcome to this edition of Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer from the Department of Sociology at Western Michigan University, and I'll be the host for today's program. And I want you to first of all notice our new set. Isn't this fantastic? The new look for the program. And so we want to give a shout out to our excellent technical crew, Dan Smith, Bob Kilday, Larry Mahana. Those guys do fantastic work behind the scenes, and they make it all possible. They even make us look good sometimes, and that's hard to do. So joining me today are two of our regular viewmeisters, and that's what Bill O'Brien, the founding producer and director of this program, used to call us. So the two viewmeisters joining me today are Don Cooney. Don is a professor in the School of Social Work at Western Michigan University, and recently voted the vice mayor of Kalamazoo. So congratulations, Don.
Thank you, Ron.
In the November city elections, Don got the most votes of any of the city commission candidates, which makes him the vice mayor. We now elect the mayor separately, and Bobby Hopeful got reelected as mayor, but you're now serving as the vice mayor, so congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And also joining me today is the Dean of Diversity from Kalamazoo Valley Community College, Felix Brooks. Felix serves as the director of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at Kalamazoo Valley Community College. And we just want to point out that Felix is featured in this current edition of Encore Magazine. I don't know if we can get a look at that or not, but Encore Magazine is available all around town. And right in the middle, there's a nice spread on Felix. Oh, I got the wrong one.
One before.
Yeah, there it is. There he is. Looking good, a nice color picture of Felix, and it's a great story about the work that Felix has been doing out at Kalamazoo Valley Community College, so congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Nice going, Felix.
And originally for this program, I had hoped to focus on those two things, Don getting elected vice mayor of the city, the spread on Felix, talking about the great work that he's been doing out at KVCC, but in the meantime, we had another mass shooting, several more mass shootings here in the United States. And with a little prodding from some members of our technical crew, Larry Mahana in particular, we decided to change our focus and talk about gun violence and mass killings. Now, this is not a new topic. We have talked about this issue before on the program, so we're sort of revisiting it. But I think given the number of shootings that have occurred and the great concern that there is all across the country about this issue, that it would be appropriate for us today to focus on this. So, so let's take a look at this whole issue. One of the things that's been prominently featured is the idea that there have been almost one mass killing for every day of the year this year, depending on how you count what a mass killing constitutes. But we also want to point out that it's not just the mass killings, but it's also the day-to-day routine violence that we see. Often the gun violence in the inner city, in particular, is also a major concern. So, Felix, let's jump in here. What's your take on how we begin to focus on this particular issue?
When we were talking earlier, I said, that in my mind's eye, I go back to Sandy Hook. And I think that, and I thought and wanted to believe that Sandy Hook, the killings there, the mass shootings there, particularly because it involved kids, would be a watershed moment. That would be a wake-up call for us, despite all the calls that we had before about doing something about this, to do something about gun violence in this country. And we did not respond in a way that I thought was appropriate whatsoever. The whole issue continued to be politicized. And I think that we're there again now, because this whole notion of mass shootings and is becoming something that happens on a regular basis. It doesn't happen anywhere else in the world, except for here. In the United States. Nowhere else in the world is this a commonality. And what is it about American society that produces these conditions? And I think a lot of it has to do, again, with the proliferation of guns and our mentality with respect to those guns.
Right, totally
How many guns
agree.
do we have in the United States, Don?
We have over 300 million guns available in the United States. Almost at least one gun for every person. And they're all over the place. I mean, and the people that have them, it's amazing to me how many they had. This couple that in the San Bernardino area, I mean, they had a whole arsenal in there. Thousands of bullets, pipe bombs, guns, all kinds of things. And no problem getting any of that. Just crazy.
Now, I want to make one point here, and that is that certainly guns are an important part of American culture. And my dad was a hunter, and my brother's a gun collector, and so there's clearly a very important tradition of guns and the peaceful use of guns, or guns being used as tools in this country, and so we want to certainly acknowledge that particular issue, that guns are a deep part of American culture. But when we're having carnage on this level,
yeah.
when we're having mass murders, I think we have to step back and take another look at the gun issue. Now, another problem is that this is one of those issues that has become completely polarized. As so many issues in our political discourse, it's just completely polarized. And so, unfortunately, there are probably a lot of people who would start to watch this program and hear us talking about doing something about guns and would completely dismiss the whole thing and would not listen. I mean, we're going to try to present a lot of research evidence today and provide some historical perspective. And I think we're going to do so in a very objective manner, looking at research evidence that's been developed by criminologists and others. But that doesn't matter to some of the people out there who are fanatical about guns.
Especially if you're in denial about it,
Yeah.
It's not going to matter.
And it's like so many other issues, whether it's the climate change issue or other issues, the evidence and logical thinking don't seem to play any role in it.
No.
It's a strong ideological and cultural commitment to a particular idea, and the evidence doesn't sway people at all.
So it appeals to the gut more than it does the head.
Right.
Yes.
Not a rational thing.
Yeah.
It becomes
It's
an extremely emotional issue. And I see that in a lot of my students, criminal justice students, by the way, in our program, that have that kind of emotional attachment to guns as well and wanting to come into criminal justice. So I just wanted to get that out on the table. Now, we're going to go ahead and present the evidence and talk about the history and try to do so in an objective fashion. But I do want to recognize that this is an extremely polarized debate in our country, and also to recognize, again, the historical importance of guns in American culture. Maybe one way to start is to talk about the Second Amendment. What does the Second Amendment say? Anybody got it memorized?
I know it
Felix
speaks to this whole notion of a well-regulated militia, followed by statements about the right of people to bear arms should not be impeded.
Right.
And I'm probably paraphrasing there. But to me, the important part is the militia piece
Yeah.
Right.
and what that means.
It starts, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's the full text of the Second Amendment.
Right.
Now, what's interesting to me is that for many of the people on the one side, the gun industry, the NRA, and the gun supporters, the Second Amendment is sacred. It's sacred, and it cannot be violated in any way, shape, or form. And yet, these people completely ignore half of the amendment. If you go to Washington, D.C., to the NRA building, they have the Second Amendment up on the building, or at least part of it. What part do you think they don't have up on the wall?
Probably the regulated part.
A well-regulated militia.
Yeah.
They totally eliminate that. And most of the time when we're talking about the Second Amendment, there's no reference at all to that. And in fact, even at the Supreme Court, Anthony Scalia wrote the opinion in a very famous case that I want to talk about here in a moment, D.C. versus Heller. And Scalia totally ignores that opening phrase. He said it's a prefatory phrase, so he didn't need to deal with it. And that's just appalling logic, first of all, and incomplete. I mean, what happens with that Supreme Court decision is that the plain language of the Second Amendment is completely ignored. The history of the development of the Second Amendment is ignored. And then finally, all the legal precedents that led up to this were completely ignored by the court in that opinion. One of the worst opinions ever written by the Supreme Court, and Scalia took the lead in writing that opinion, D.C. versus Heller. And it broke all the precedent, because what D.C. versus Heller said is that owning a gun, it's an individual right under the Second Amendment to own a gun. That had never been the legal ruling prior to that.
No, not until that time, never.
So the debate that had developed is, does the Second Amendment confer a collective right? This is the notion to a well-regulated state militia, right? Or did it constitute an individual right? And all the previous court rulings had said that it was a collective right.
Wow.
And in fact, one of the most famous cases was U.S. versus Miller in 1939. And it involved a case where the 1934 National Firearms Act was being challenged as unconstitutional under the Second Amendment. A guy had been caught with basically a sawed-off shotgun and had been prosecuted. And they were trying to say, you can't prosecute him. This law is illegal under the Second Amendment. And the Supreme Court in U.S. versus Miller basically said, well, if we consider a well-regulated militia, is this the type of weapon that would be necessary for a well-regulated militia? No. And therefore, they said, no, we're not going to throw this case out. And the guy was prosecuted and convicted. And so always it had been interpreted in terms of that. And of course, the history is to say, you know, the well-regulated state militias. And there's actually a deeper aspect to this. And that is that originally the state militias were really slave patrols. And the reason the Second Amendment comes about in the whole debate over the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is that the southern states wanted the ability to continue to terrorize and control slaves. And so
states' rights again.
it was a states' right issue.
Racist.
That's why that particular
Slave.
language is in there, state militias. And the state militias were constituted to go out and make sure that slaves were, the slaves were still there on the plantations, that they weren't escaping. If they did escape, to mount up the patrol and go after them.
Wow.
And they wanted to make sure that the federal government, the newly created federal government under the Constitution, would not be able to interfere with these state militias, to wipe these state militias out and say that there has to be only the national federal army. They wanted the ability.
You had the whole fugitive slave law that was still in play back in those days. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's really part of the origin of the Second Amendment, is that the state militias, which mostly were southern state militias, which were mostly slave patrols, that's really the origins of the Second Amendment. And why it has that particular language, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. It's not talking about the country as a whole, it's talking about individual states. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, the other interesting thing is that notion of bearing arms. In the 18th century, that meant participating in the military.
Yeah. Exactly.
It didn't mean you as an individual have a right to bear arms. It meant you had the ability to participate in the military. That's what bear arms means. And even the term the people, that's a collective term. That doesn't refer to specific individuals. That's a collective term. We, the people of the United States, created the Constitution, right? That's a collective endeavor. It's not an individual right. So the history and the plain language of the Second Amendment would suggest that it's a collective right. And that's always what courts have ruled up to this point.
To this point.
Now, for the last 30 years, the National Rifle Association has launched a huge political and symbolic campaign to reinterpret the Second Amendment, to eliminate that first part, a well-regulated militia, to recast the Second Amendment as a matter of individual rights. And along the way, they've been very successful in creating a political movement. They've been able to win adherents like Anthony Scalia, who now sits on the Supreme Court. And as a result of all this, we get the D.C. versus Heller decision in 2008.
Wow.
The District of Columbia had banned all guns in the district. And Heller and others went to court to basically say this is unconstitutional under the Second Amendment. People have an individual right to bear arms. Scalia was able to win over Justice Roberts and also Justice Kennedy to the side. Again, it's a 5-4 decision. Almost all Supreme Court decisions are 5-4.
Kennedy's the swing, right?
Kennedy's the swing, sometimes Roberts, but both Roberts and Kennedy, to their great shame, went over. I mean, this was just an appalling legal decision.
Wow.
Just an appalling, the legal reasoning, and Scalia totally ignoring, And Scalia's always the one who wants to go back to original intent.
The original intent, exactly.
The conservatives always want to go back to the original intent of the founders when they created the Constitution. And of course, they completely ignored it in this particular case. So that's part of what's going on here.
Wow. And that's had huge implications for that.
Oh, yeah.
That just opened the doors, opened the floodgates,
Yeah, because now whenever so we're at the point where we have these mass killings and the routine gun violence, and we say, what can we do about it, right? And anything that we propose to do about it, then immediately there's the hurdle.
The Second Amendment. You're taking away people's individual rights to hold guns,
Yeah.
And we know that in other countries, particularly in Australia, that was one of the precedents we talked about in '96, they had a mass killing. And as a result, they took that as a watershed moment. We're going to do something about this. We're going to get as many guns as we can off the streets. And they proceeded to do that. They had a huge buyback. And since that time, they've had not a single mass killing on Australian soil. Not one. So it proves that you can do this.
Yeah.
You can remove weapons and guns from the hands of common folks and not have a society deteriorate into chaos, because that hasn't happened.
Yeah, the Australia case is really interesting because, first of all, there was the massive buyback, as you mentioned,
Yep.
and I think they got something like 600,000 guns that
Wow.
they were able,
Yep.
and many of them were the semi-automatic rifle, the assault rifle,
Assault
or
rifles.
however you define that category. They were to get a lot of those more lethal kinds of weapons off the street. But they also provided that people had to register to own a gun. And to register to own a gun, you had to have a reason why you wanted to have the legal permission to own a gun.
Right.
And you could not use self-defense as one of the reasons. That was an illegitimate reason in the minds of the Australian legislators. And so they got a lot of guns off the street. They restricted who could own guns. And it just made a huge difference. As you said, there hasn't been a mass killing in Australia since then. This took place in 1996. It was a horrific case,
Yeah.
by the way. 35 people killed,
Lot, a
23
lot.
wounded. It happened in Tasmania,
Yeah.
the state of Tasmania, the island to the south of the mainland in Australia. But since then, not one killing. But also, homicides in Australia went down 59%.
It's amazing.
59% from 1998 to 2006.
And then some of the pushback that they got at the time was that it would increase the amount of home invasions that were happening in the time, because people wouldn't be able to protect themselves, and that didn't happen
Right.
at all. In fact, anyway, like Ron said, crime actually went down as a result of that.
So reasonable laws are possible,
Yeah.
and we have so many
and reasonable
examples of them.
regulations.
Yeah, right.
I mean, we live in a society, and I said this before, where you have to go through more to get a driver's license than you do to get a gun.
Makes no sense.
I mean,
No
we take,
sense at all.
kids have to have X amount of hours of time behind the wheel to demonstrate their proficiency before we put you behind the wheel of a car. We don't have any of that when it comes to guns. We don't none of the reasonable background checks or waiting periods. That stuff is an anathema to the people who are opposed to this, because you're usurping people's Second Amendment rights by doing that.
So we look at Australia. How about other developed countries? How do we rank against them?
I mean, think about Japan. I think it was in 2010 or 2011, their most recent statistics, they had 11 deaths by gun in a country of 270 million people, where gun ownership is rare, and yet the society hasn't delved into chaos. There's not anarchy there. People can live side by side one another without being armed to the teeth. So we know that clearly around the world that where there's not a proliferation of guns, people seem to get along fairly well.
Yeah, in United Kingdom, extremely
yeah.
difficult to get a gun. Yeah, so we're way out of step with all the other developed countries.
We're out of step both in terms of our homicide rates.
Yep.
I mean,
Yeah.
lethal violence is really the huge problem with crime in the United States. And if we compare the United States to other Western industrialized democratic countries, we're just so far out there. It's just amazing the gap between the number of homicides per 100,000 that occur in the United States compared to Britain and Norway are higher than most of the rest of Europe. But when you compare Britain and Norway to the United States, it's like,
joke.
it
Yeah.
just jumps off the chart. So
And the same thing is true. It sort of mirrors our incarceration rates. Our incarceration rates are about, 700 per every 100,000? No one else in the world is even close
No.
to that.
China's next, I think, and they're way down behind.
So we have all these guns, and we have all this criminalization that goes on, and it's had very little in the way of impact.
And one of the things that always strikes me is the innocent people that are getting killed. I mean, it's not like they have a particular person that they're going to go after. They do that sometimes. But there's so many other people in there that are being killed. I mean, and our responsibility to protect our
Yep.
own people is just pushed aside.
And yet we can't come up with, I can't see a logical reason for why an individual should be able to own an assault weapon.
Right, right.
I've yet to be convinced why that's a necessity.
Yeah, I mean, individual freedom versus the collective good. I mean, who was the Supreme Court justice says that it's okay to holler fire, but not in a crowded
Indeed,
building,
yeah.
right? So, I I mean, it's so evident that the vast majority of people are being harmed by this.
Yeah, so even if we say, yes, the Second Amendment provides some measure, and now with DC versus Heller, it does say that it's an individual right. That is the established law at this
So
point.
far.
But even at that point, let's go back to Scalia's decision. Even Antonio Scalia said there still can be restrictions and regulations and limitations on the right to own guns. It is a fundamental right, but the state still has an abiding interest in certain sensible, reasonable regulations. So now whether that was just sort of his sop to the other side in that decision, but it's an important point that he made.
It is.
That it doesn't rule out the fact that there still can be some kind of sensible regulations that are going to be imposed.
It's got legitimacy.
Like a waiting period.
Yeah.
well,
a universal background check.
Universal background checks. I mean, there's such a loophole there. If you go to a federally regulated dealer, then there's a background check, and they're going to check your criminal record. Hopefully, there'll be some. And again, we often don't find evidence about people's mental problems at that point.
That's right.
But there are so many other loopholes there. Gun shows and private transactions and third-party transactions, and there's just a lot of things that go on that allow so many more guns to get out there in the hands of people that probably we don't want to have them, right?
And the kinds of guns, too. I mean, like, we could ban certain guns, certainly submachine guns or these other guns that could not be used for hunting or anything else, but we allow them to
They're
be.
designed just for what they've done, mass killings. So there's a difference in my mind between I'm going to defend my home, whether I believe that or not, and the ability to be able to kill 15 people in 20 seconds.
Right.
Yeah, the high capacity ammunition magazines is another issue.
Yeah.
I mean, at least if you limited those, the people that are perpetrating mass murders have to stop and reload, right? I mean, it provides a chance for some intervention, whether the police are already on the scene or not.
And I mentioned that I was in Denver during the day before and I was there for that whole week for the Aurora shootings, and that was an example of a guy having a high magazine weapon that he could use and reload, and he was able to kill that many people as a result of being able to do that. And what's the point?
Yeah.
Why should the average citizen have the ability to own that type of gun? He's clearly not protecting himself. He's doing that for what the gun was designed to do, which is kill mass amounts of people.
Yeah.
And by the way, it does seem that there are an awful lot of gun owners who are sort of making that position. I've seen evidence of people who are gun owners, maybe even members of the NRA, coming forward and saying, look, this is crazy, this has got to stop. I'm a gun owner. I think we have a right to own guns, but certain kinds of weapons and these high-capacity magazines and those kinds of things, the fact that we don't have universal background checks, I mean, these are very minimal steps. These are very little steps, actually, if we want to talk about dealing with the overall level of gun violence in the country. These are very minimal kinds of steps, and yet we can't take them because of some interpretations of the Second Amendment, but also because of the political activities of the gun industry. So let's focus on that for just a moment. So we have the National Rifle Association, which is a very powerful organization, and the NRA started out as a group for hunters and people who were using guns recreationally. As we said earlier, it has been an important part of American culture.
Yeah.
But in more recent years, the NRA has, to me, become this extremist organization that opposes any kind of sensible regulations. And it seems to me that it's out of step with many of its members, but it clearly has become a 800-pound gorilla in the American political system. And it has a huge influence on legislators at the state level and as well in Congress.
And they're very intentional about that, though. I mean, they have their buildings in Washington, D.C. There's a reason that they're headquartered there.
Yeah.
They want to be close to the people who make policy.
And in the local level, too, they've been very active. I mean, my brother lives in Philadelphia, and they tried to pass a law that said you could only buy one gun a month. One gun a month. You think that would be enough, 12 a year. But they couldn't get that through. They had the power to stop that right there in the local level.
Yeah.
I mean, the NRA always trots out the slippery slope argument, right? Any minimal step
Right.
toward regulating a well-regulated militia. Any minimal step toward a sensible gun laws to them is, boy, as soon as you do that, then the next thing you know, the feds are going to be in your bedroom confiscating your guns, right?
Taking your guns. So
And-
they use fear.
They use
Yeah,
fear.
right.
They use fear. But they also use very well-established lobbying techniques and
Oh,
huge
yeah.
campaign
Lot of money.
contributions. I think it's interesting if we compare the gun industry and the gun lobby with the tobacco industry and the tobacco lobbies. I think there's some parallels here. We know that, of course, tobacco was a huge problem in this society, causing
Yeah.
a tremendous amount of suffering and death. And eventually we were able to do something about that, right?
Mm-hmm.
At one point, smoking was widely accepted and advertised and not challenged at all. And we went from that situation to where we actually had very considerable regulations
Yeah.
on the tobacco industry. A huge lawsuit was filed against them. You can't advertise cigarettes anymore on television. There was, cigarette-free zones all over the place. We did lots of things. We taxed it. We taxed it hugely. Great increase in sales tax. So we did a lot of things. And so the gun lobby saw that as an instructive case. We don't want that to happen to us, what
Right.
happened to the tobacco industry. So they set about trying to undo or block each one of those different avenues. So for example, seeing that the tobacco industry was held legally liable for the suffering and death that it caused, and the lying about the death and suffering
Right.
that it caused. It knew that tobacco was addictive, and they knew that it was deadly, and yet they hid the evidence or denied the evidence for many years. And eventually they were hit with a huge RICO lawsuit, racketeering influenced and corrupt organizations lawsuit. They lost that lawsuit. In 1998, they ended up having to settle with 46 state attorney generals also in another case. And so the tobacco industry was really dealt a severe blow by legal actions and being held legally liable. And the gun industry saw that, and they set about making sure that that wouldn't happen to them. And they were very successful. In 2005, during the George W. Bush administration, they were able to get passed, here's the full title of it, the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. And essentially, it shielded the gun industry from legal liability. So again, that one of the avenues that was used to attack the tobacco industry, they've sort of taken out of existence. Now, we also know that with the tobacco industry, the report of the Surgeon General back
Yeah.
in 1964 played a huge role. Because here's the Surgeon General, Luther Terry, coming out and establishing the link between smoking and health.
Right.
All right?
Right.
So the gun industry doesn't want any kind of federal report coming from the Surgeon General or the Centers for Disease Control or the National Institute of Health. So they've set about creating a blockage. You can no longer do research at the
government level,
at the
at the
Center for
federal level.
Disease Control and Prevention. And again, that was a 1968 law that was passed. Representative Jay Dickey, a Republican from Arkansas, it banned research on injury prevention and control. And in 2012, there was an appropriation for similar restrictions in the National Institute of Health for funding. So basically, there's no research on gun violence at the federal level.
None.
And we have some that's come from criminologists and others, but it has to be funded separately. The government agencies that are responsible for protecting the health of the American people are prohibited by law from doing research.
I bet you the vast majority of American people have no idea that
don't
that's
have
the
a clue.
case. Not a clue.
Yeah, yeah. So here's the gun lobby saying, well, first of all, we're gonna influence Congress and get protection from lawsuits. So you can't file lawsuits
Yeah.
against us. Now we're gonna block any research at the federal level. So you can't know what harm we're causing. They also have, of course, been working very hard to make sure that there aren't any increases on sales tax on guns or ammunition, which again, one of the ways we try to dissuade people from tobacco.
Sure.
They've been able to block all of that. They've also been able to get pressure on individual state legislatures to pass what are called state preemption laws, which basically the state legislature says, look, you there in Kalamazoo, you can't do anything at the local level to
Right.
harm the gun industry.
Yeah, and I asked our city attorney, what steps could we take here? And he said, none. There's nothing you can do. However, a lot of the mayors in the United States now are coming together and demanding the right to do something about it because of the terrible harms that's going on in their state. But so far, our hands are tied.
I think, our concealed carry now is going to be all done at the state level now?
Yeah.
No longer at all the local gun boards are
Boards
gone?
have been abolished.
They've been all abolished?
Yep, it's
Yeah.
all at the federal, state level.
And those
State level.
boards used to consist of the prosecuting attorney, the sheriff, and one of the judges, circuit court judges. And if you wanted to get a concealed carry permit, you had to appear in front of that board, and you had to convince that board why it was necessary for you to have this permit. And you had to have some pretty good reasons. I mean, back in the day when it was Jim Gregert and Tom Edmonds and one of the circuit court judges, you really had to convince them. They weren't going to give you one. They weren't just going to hand them out willy-nilly.
No, and they were from the community, and they recognized the impact on the community.
And then the first step was to basically reduce the power of those boards. To basically say, look, if somebody appears in front of you and they don't have a criminal record and they're not obviously crazy, then you have to, you shall permit them to carry a concealed weapon. So the board couldn't deny that, the board couldn't investigate the reasons why a person wanted to have this permit and perhaps deny some of them. If they simply appeared in front of them and met the minimal criteria, they had to issue the permit. Now they've completely done away with these boards at all. And there have been all kinds of efforts. This is one of the things that the NRA and it's the gun lobbies have been working on, is to reduce all the restrictions on where people can carry guns. Everybody should be able to get a permit to carry a concealed weapon. There are open carry laws. And so now they're trying to, one of their big targets now is college campuses, to allow for open carry on college campuses. And so again, this is again, they saw what happened with regard to the tobacco industry when smoking was being banned from this place and that place, safe locations or banned locations. And they're working very hard to eliminate any of those kinds of restrictions. And one of the key arguments here is that, well, this is going to make us safer, right? More guns equals less crime.
That's the
right.
That's
the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, right? Wayne LaPierre, the head of the NRA, famously said that a while back. And so this has become an important cultural story, cultural narrative. I would say that it's a myth. It's not true. In fact, the more guns that we have, the less safe we are, and the more harm that occurs. But this is an exceedingly difficult idea to get around because so many people believe it. Oh, if only somebody there had a gun, they would have been able to stop that massacre, right?
Right.
If only a good guy with a gun. Or if the criminals think everybody's carrying a gun, they won't invade your home or mug you on the street, right? They'll be deterred from the threat. And this is such a strong narrative that's out there. It's completely at odds with all the research evidence that we have. The guy that's been promoting this the most is a guy by the name of John Lott, who I think is a legal scholar someplace, fancies himself as a criminologist. And he wrote a book called More Guns, Less Crime. And his argument was that the more guns that are out there, the less crime we'll have. The more states allow people to carry concealed weapons, the more the bad guys will think there are guns out there and they'll be deterred. Or somebody will intervene with a defensive use of the gun, and crime will go down dramatically. And he presents all these stories and all this evidence in the book. It turns out that when we look closely at the evidence that he produced, that it was badly flawed, tremendous methodological problems with his approach. In fact, and he's been a very controversial figure, but basically he's been totally discredited. He's been totally discredited, his ideas. There was a National Research Council report that came out in 2005, and this was some of the big heavyweights in my field. You know, my field is criminology, and so some of the biggest names in the field were on this panel that investigated this. And they came back and said, we don't find any support, no support for Lott's conclusions in this book. And again, you can't get more discredited than to have a National Research Council report come out and say basically there's no evidence to support your argument. But yet, Lott is still out there. He's still popular.
very
Michigan,
popular.
somebody in the Republican Party in Michigan brought him in to testify just a couple of months ago to loosen up some of the other restrictions on guns in our state, saying that, you know, if we do this, the crime will go down because this guy's research proves it, but it doesn't prove it. And this whole notion that the defensive use of guns occurs on a regular basis and that's very important. I mean, there's one other scholar out there who argued that this happens about 3 million times a year, the defensive use of guns, 3 million times a year, and so it prevents an enormous amount of crime. Well, it turns out that that's, again, riddled with methodological flaws, and the number is far, far lower than that. It may be down to around 100,000. The Bureau of Justice Statistics undertook an investigation of this, looking at National Crime Victimization Survey data. This is basically crime victimization survey data. It's one of the most important ways we have of knowing about crime. You probably talk about it
in my class all
in
the
the
time.
delinquency class.
Oh, yeah.
As I do. It's in addition to the FBI's Uniform Crime Reports, the NCVS data, National Crime Victimization Survey data, is some of the best data that we have. Well, the Bureau of Justice Statistics did this study, and what they found was that the self-defensive use of guns occurs in less than 1%, of all contact crimes, less than 1%. So, again, yes, it happens. There are occasions when people who have a gun are able to use it and ward off an attacker or defend their home. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen. It does happen. So there are some good uses for guns in that respect. But it happens so infrequently.
Oh, yeah.
And oftentimes what you have in these debates is people will argue the exception as if it's the rule.
That's right.
That this is what the norm is, and when in fact that's not the case.
Yeah, not at all.
It happens very, very rarely. But again, you're talking about making an emotional argument, an argument at the gut, as opposed to an argument at the head.
Right, right.
And
so,
playing on fear.
Right, playing on fear again. So you bring in this woman who was home by herself, and somebody broke in and was going to rape her, and she had a gun, and she was able to use it. And again, that does happen.
It's real.
It is real. So there are occasions when there is the defensive use of a gun, and it helps in some situations. So there are good uses of guns and there are bad uses of guns. The problem is the good uses of guns are so rare, and the bad uses of guns are so frequent that it's overwhelmingly, the bad uses of guns has overwhelmed the good uses of guns. And there's just an awful lot of research that shows the opposite of what John Lott had argued, that more guns does not equal less crime. More guns means more violence, more homicides, more suicides.
More unintended. How many times have we read, the 6-year-old kid shoots his 3-year-old brother with a gun that was in the house that nobody was,
just available.
They're just available there.
Yeah. You mentioned suicides. I think there's more suicides, dramatically more suicides than there are murders.
Yes, there are.
And those guns being available make that much easier for people who haven't thought things through.
There are about 31,000 gun deaths in the United States every year, but about 19,000 of those are suicides.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that in Australia that we talked about earlier, suicides went down dramatically as well.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it
Along
wasn't
with
just that the
break-ins,
homicide rate
murders,
went way down. Suicides dropped enormously in that situation as well.
So 31,000, how many people die in car accidents a year? Is it about 25, something like that?
I think 60,000 lives are lost as a result of car accidents.
A year?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's still more than this.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's still more than this, yeah.
But again, we have a situation where if there are guns being kept in the house, it usually, and people have great intentions. Oh, I want to protect my family. And that's a very noble sentiment. But the fact is that by keeping a gun in your home, you are actually increasing the risk of harm.
Yeah.
People who have guns in the household are much more likely to become victims of homicide. And they're, again, more likely to have these accidental shootings occur, more likely for that gun to be used in a domestic disturbance. That's one of the the key findings is that when there are guns present in the home and a domestic violence situation occurs, women are often the victims of gunplay in that
More often
situation.
lose those guns as a result of somebody breaking into their home.
Yeah, right, right.
So it's not just at the household level. There's also research from criminologists that demonstrate that at the state level. So those states that have a greater proportion of guns per their population have higher rates of homicide and higher rates of suicide in those states. So the fewer guns you have in your state, the better off you are. Your homicide rate's going to be lower. And this also, there's even country level data. Those countries that have more guns have much higher rates of homicide. The United States, the leading case, but even taking the United States out of the equation, if you have a society where there are more guns, generally there tend to be more homicides and more suicides. So the whole idea that by having guns that's going to make us safer, that it's going to lead to the greater defensive use of guns has just been shattered by the actual research evidence. Again, despite the fact that there are those examples of the good use of a gun, overwhelmingly the bad uses of guns outweigh that by a tremendous factor.
And the problem in this debate is that even when you present all this evidence, overwhelmingly that says that this is the case, the folks on the other side who don't want to believe that, they dismiss it.
Right, and they don't even want to hear it. They don't want to consider it.
Nope.
It's freely denied. Yeah, even though, especially, and that's because of all the money and the power of the
There's a
NRA.
vested interest in keeping things the way they are. You know, the weapons business, the gun business
Doing great.
makes a whole lot of money for a whole lot of people.
Yeah,
And they make more money when there's a mass murder.
Yeah.
Because it increases the fear.
people go out and
And-
buy.
Right, so people in droves then go and buy guns, seeking some protection from these kind of rampages that occur. And so it's a vicious cycle. The mass murders occur, more guns are purchased, more guns lead to even more violent activity, and again, we get this vicious
And
cycle.
yet, in each one of these instances of mass shootings, what we don't hear is somebody in that building who had a gun and shot back at the perpetrator.
Right.
So there's no real way to prepare for that. And there's no way to say that that everybody should be armed too because they're going to use these guns when these things happen because it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
It's always been the police who have intervened after the fact. Despite people going out and buying more guns after these things happen, because there's no predictive model for where it's going to happen next.
Right. As long as you got them all over the place, you don't know what's going to happen.
And even when we look at police officers who are highly trained
okay.
in using their weapons, we find that often in active shooter situations, the police sometimes spray bullets around at random that they miss the intended target. They hit innocent bystanders. And these are people who are professionals and have high training.
High training.
Let alone somebody who fancies themselves a vigilante or a superhero defender who's got his weapon and he's in a situation where this happens and he pulls out his gun and he's going to save the day, right? Well, first of all, you got to stumble around and find your gun, and then you got to make sure you're hitting the appropriate target and not hitting bystanders. You better make sure you're not the one standing there with the gun when the police burst through the door.
Right.
In fact, there was a young man who had a weapon in Arizona, in Tucson, when Gabby Giffords was shot and the other people were shot. And he thought about pulling out his gun and trying to do something, but he thought, there's no way the police will be able to tell between me and the shooter.
Wow.
And if I do that, I'm just going to make myself more vulnerable to the police intervention.
Because they don't have time.
I mean, because this whole notion of somebody inside having a gun and being able to protect the folks that are in there belies the fact that you don't know if there are multiple people coming in the building. There's an assumption that, there's only one person. Well, that's not always the case. So then what do? You get out in the hallway with your supposed gun, you're going to defend people, and you realize that there's 5 people that are part of this assault, then what? Then what are you going to do? If anything, you're going to cause more harm than you're going to cause good,
Right.
And in a situation of high stress and high emotion, be able to think that you're going to coolly and calmly pull out your gun and be accurate in your marksmanship.
Right.
I mean, again, the police can't do that in many situations. And so, given all
and
their
the average
hardship.
citizen just doesn't have that kind of training because, again, we don't put any regulations behind owning a gun, so they don't have that kind of training. How to act, how to use your gun in an urban environment. Come on.
And just the idea that, okay, for our society to be safe, for there to be some level of civility in our society, everybody has to be walking around armed.
Yeah.
Well, to me, that's a horrific idea. The idea that, I mean, that's not civilization.
No.
If civility and politeness, you know, an armed society is a polite society. Well, if politeness and civility depends on the fact that I fear that you have a gun, so I'm going to be polite to you, I mean, that completely undermines the social trust and social relationships that are necessary for a civilized society to exist.
Absolutely. I mean, like, one of the things we notice in the city with the murders that we have, so many of these murders are about 2 o'clock in the morning, there's been a party, some guys get in a disagreement, one guy goes home and gets a gun and comes back. We have none of these guys on our radar. They're not any background on them at all, but there's a gun there, and he's been dissed, and he's going to come back and show this guy. And, you know, if there was an alternative, he wouldn't have shot the guy if he didn't have that gun sitting in his house. Yeah.
Makes it much more impersonal.
Right.
You know.
Yeah.
It's what criminologists call the weapons instrumentality effect. It's just a jargony and fancy term, but what it means is that if a gun is present, it can alter the entire interaction.
Changes the whole dynamic.
It might be, you know, a fight there, somebody ends up with a bloody nose or a black eye, but if a gun is present, it might lead to a homicide. And the fact is that there are so many guns that are available and present, it can transform a situation into a deadly situation.
You know, in my old job as a probation officer, there was a debate about 2/3 of the way through my career about whether or not we should carry guns.
Wow.
Probation officers, family court probation officers. And my argument at the time was no. And I said to my fellow colleagues, I said, because it changes the dynamic in any room you go in if they know you're carrying.
Yeah.
Okay?
Sure.
If they know that I have a gun on me, that changes the whole dynamic. My ability to develop relationships with these clients and these families, that changes.
Oh.
And it ratchets up the pressure if something does happen at home. Because if you have a gun, you have to have the mentality that at some point in time, I may have to use this.
Yeah.
And I said, I want no
You don't
parts
want that
of that.
option,
I want no parts of that.
Yeah.
Which is why the
No.
police officers in Great Britain don't carry guns and haven't carried guns. Because they know what that element means to a situation.
Sure. Changes everything.
Yeah, changes the whole dynamic.
And we're also insisting then that, and again, these things are still, I mean, they happen frequently in the United States, but still in the overall scheme of things, they're still relatively rare, right? And in fact, if we look at the crime statistics, crime has been coming down, violent crime included. I mean, we need to mention that. We don't, I mean, the fact that these kind of incidents occur, they occur far too often, but overall, crime and homicide have been coming down in the United States, and these things in the overall scheme are still relatively rare. But what you're doing then is you're insisting that because this rare event might occur, you're going to routinely interject guns into all situations. So there may never, ever be an active shooter at Western Michigan University, but if you allow every student to carry a gun, you're now interjecting day after day after day, year after year after year into that particular setting, vast numbers of guns, with the thought that maybe in the rare event that such a thing would happen, that somebody's going to be able to use that gun in a defensive way, the good guy with the gun to stop the bad guy with the gun, which we've already demonstrated is probably a complete fallacy anyhow. So based on that mythical possibility or that fallacy, you're going to routinely interject guns into social settings all the time. Again, it just undermines
churches,
society.
libraries,
Yeah.
you know, you name it. It makes no sense at all.
Not at all.
You know, there's no logic to it at all.
Even bars.
Yeah.
And nothing could go wrong
Yeah.
there, right?
Oh, boy.
Nothing could go wrong.
Guns and alcohol?
Guns and
Never.
alcohol.
Never.
Not a good mix.
So, and again, even the most common sense kinds of things that we could do are being blocked by the National Rifle Association, the gun industry lobby, groups like ALEC, which is a conservative group that writes legislation and basically hands it over to conservative Republican legislators for them to try to implement. So we've got this enormous political force out there, campaign contributions and lobbying and legislative influence that's going on. So even the most commonsensical kinds of things are difficult to enact. So it seems to be a very frustrating situation.
Think about this. We've already got Syrian immigrants coming into this country that we vet over a 2-year period. And congressmen on the right are concerned that these people may still be dangerous.
Right.
But we don't even do close to that amount of vetting to to hand a person in the United States a gun? I mean, just think about the logic between those two things. What are we more fearful of? And I mean, an act of terror on our soil from a foreign immigrant is much more rare than what's going on here.
Absolutely.
With these homegrown shootings.
Yeah.
Because of people's ability to be able to get guns. But we don't want to talk about that. We don't want to have that conversation.
You wonder about a place like Chicago, where even though crime statistics are going down nationwide, murders are going up in Chicago because of one of the causes is, and I think it's important to emphasize that, the availability of guns is one of the factors, but there's a lot more factors in the violence that's going on in our country. But there's so many guns on the street in Chicago, and a lot of them have been killing bystanders, innocent people on it.
And here's the funny part about that, because I know Chicago's gone out of its way to try to ban guns, the sale of guns within its borders. Most of those guns that they've been able to confiscate come from other counties.
Right. New York, similar situation.
Come from, from downstate or other states.
Yeah.
Because the city of Chicago proper wanted to make it, just like Washington, D.C. did, wanted to make it almost impossible for people to buy guns. Because they recognize what you did down there. We got a problem here.
Yeah.
Let's at least make it difficult for folks to get these things in their hands. Mm-hmm. And the NRA says no.
And that law was one that was struck down by the Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court. That was a companion case.
That was the other case, the McDonald versus Chicago case in 2010. Yeah. And again, you can't even enact these more common sense kind of regulations, and yet the broader social conditions that lead to that level of violence in those inner city neighborhoods.
Right.
I mean, the poverty, the economic inequality, the alienation, the lack of jobs, all of that fosters that kind of violence. We need to be understanding and dealing with that. If we're, the way to deal with that violence is to address those underlying social conditions, not to interject even more guns and more police presence into the situation, which is always the answer that we come up with.
You always say, Ron, social supports reduce crime, and a lack of supports increase crime.
Yeah.
And that's exactly, we are withdrawing the social supports
we're
greatly.
withdrawing that,
Yeah, and that happens at every single level, neighborhood, household, neighborhood, state, country. It's just a very consistent finding by criminologists. The greater the provision of social support and public services, the less crime that you have. And of course, what we've been doing politically in this country is withdrawing those social services and support at the very time when economic conditions are deteriorating and inequality is growing greater. And so you have a more concentrated, isolated form of poverty that's developing with very little in the way of social services and public support. And of course, violence is going to increase.
Yeah, and we talked earlier about these alienated white older men, middle-aged men or older that are out there killing people. And the study that was just done recently that showed about the excess deaths in that group because they're so alienated and they're estranged from society. And this group now they're dying at an earlier age, and we see some of them picking up the guns and going out and killing people because they're just so alienated from anything
and
that's
those
going
are
on.
the people that the Donald Trumps of the world appeal to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because they can get you at your gut level at fear of being overwhelmed, fear of loss of your place in society.
For those white working class men that are angry and frustrated and alienated from society, one of the major causes of death among that group, and it's only one of the few groups where mortality rates are increasing, suicide.
Suicide is right.
By gun. Suicide by gun.
Right. And the support is not there for those guys. They're losing their jobs. They don't have the skills for something new coming down the line, and they're just out there. And then that sets a stage for these other kinds of things.
The world is changing, and again, it's hard for them to accommodate or adapt to those changes, and they feel like they're the ones getting the short end of the stick, and so it leads to a lot of anger and frustration. The other thing I'd like to just mention also is the connection, and nobody hardly ever mentions this or even considers this, but the connection between foreign policy and violence at home. I mean, we have a foreign policy that's essentially based on violence.
Absolutely.
Based on imperial violence, fighting wars, bombing people with drones, putting boots on the ground, intervening in this country or that country. And there is a connection between that kind of imperial violence and what's going on in the streets.
Well, 1967, Martin Luther King's speech at the Riverside Church. when he said, they say to me, go out and tell these guys in the city, stop the violence. And he said, but then I look and see that my country is the greatest proliferator of violence in the world. And how can I go out and tell them not to have violence? Because that's how we solve
Our national
all our
mindset,
problems,
yeah.
by violence.
Yeah, we solve by violence.
And it's not just that is there and is kind of a part of the broader cultural narrative of using violence to solve problems, becomes part of our cultural response to violence and problems to use violence. But it also is the factor that increases terrorism.
Yeah.
There's clear
Good point.
research. Robert Pape at the University of Chicago has demonstrated that suicide bombing, suicide terrorism, in almost every case is related to foreign military occupation. Foreign military occupation and the use of violence against people in other countries is the leading factor in suicide terrorism.
Huh.
And so our imperial violence abroad in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Yemen, wherever we're engaged, Syria now, that is a leading factor in causing people to hate the United States and want to carry out terroristic attacks against them.
Interesting.
The leading
Like
cause of terrorism.
ISIS uses that as a recruiting tool.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we never
Absolutely.
seem to draw the connection that the level of violence that we're inflicting through our foreign policy creates and produces more terrorism. And yet when terrorism occurs, what's our response? To ratchet up the violence, right? And all countries do it. Great Britain's doing it. I mean,
France is doing it.
France
Germany's
is
doing
doing
it.
the exact same thing. So what's the answer to violence? More violence. And of course, the violence perpetuates, begets more violence. And so we end up with this sort of vicious cycle.
Yeah.
And you would
Wow.
think that we would have learned that, having watched what's gone on in the Middle East with the Israelis and the Palestinians, that cycle never ends. It just
No.
feeds on itself.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly, yeah. Andrew Basevich has been writing on that recently about what do we think we're doing? But there's no success. And even if we were successful, what would happen afterwards?
Exactly.
And so the whole is a bankrupt foreign policy.
For those that are interested in further analyzing the comments, the brief comments that we've made here about American foreign policy and the violence that's part of that policy and how it leads to greater terrorism, I would recommend that they go to the website tomdispatch.com. Tom Engelhardt runs this website and on usually every other day has a writer who produces a really excellent piece. That
Very good.
Really, and Andrew Basevich is one of the people who writes there frequently. And really great analysis. So if you really want to get a broader picture, I would recommend that. We only have a minute to go. I also want to point out that Juan Cole, the professor from the University of Michigan, is going to be on the campus at Western Michigan University on Wednesday, December the 9th. So if you're watching this before December 9th, you can get a chance to go catch Juan Cole. His Informed Consent blog is one of the best sources of information about what's happening in the Middle East.
What time is that?
6 o'clock at the Fetzer Center on Western's campus on Wednesday, December the 9th.
Wow.
Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank
Don,
you.
Felix,
You did great. No kidding. Great.
Great to be together and talk about these important issues, to develop critical perspectives on and alternative views on these issues. We thank you for joining us, and we invite you to come back and visit us again on Critical Issues, Alternative Views.